Hello, action flick fans. I'm Ryan, your guide through the explosive world of King of the New York, a blockbuster that stormed theaters in 1990. Warning, this video is loaded with action-packed spoilers. Fasten your seatbelts, and let's dive into the adrenaline-fueled chaos. On a sunny day, a man named Frank finally got out of prison after being locked up for 14 years. Frank used to be a powerful mafia boss running illegal operations in New York City, but upon his release, he found that things had changed significantly. The Colombian and Chinese drug gangs had taken over the drug and prostitution businesses that used to be under his control. In another part of the city, a man named Emilio, who ran a Colombian prostitution operation, went to a pay phone and was suddenly shot. This was the end of him. The individuals responsible for the shooting made sure Emilio saw a newspaper report announcing Frank's release from prison. Simultaneously, a guy named Jimmy was in a hotel room trying to make a drug deal with King Tito, one of the big Colombian drug bosses. However, Jimmy talked too much and annoyed King Tito, who suddenly raised the price by 10%. Surprised, Jimmy handed over a suitcase full of money, but when they opened it, they found it was full of tampons. Jimmy lost his composure and shot King Tito and his men. After dealing with the Colombians, Jimmy and his gang met up with Frank in another hotel room. It was evident that Jimmy's crew had killed Emilio, and Frank was the mastermind behind it all. Jimmy welcomed Frank back and explained that they had not only eliminated Emilio and King Tito but had also taken their money and assets. Jimmy also mentioned a meeting they had set up with a middleman named Delicio. Curious, Frank prepared for the meeting, where he met with lawyers, politicians, and a judge. Then, he talked to Delicio and asked for assistance in arranging a meeting with Clay, a big drug boss. Frank acted as though he wanted to re-enter the illegal business. After Delicio left, Frank took a counselor named Jennifer for a walk in the subway. Meanwhile, Delicio went to meet Clay, who was having a good time with friends at a gambling place. Delicio informed Clay about Frank's message, but Clay wasn't interested and made fun of Frank for associating with rival gangsters. He stated that he only wanted to do business with the Colombians and told Delicio to give Frank a resounding no. The story now takes us to a crowded subway car, where Frank and Jennifer are enjoying themselves. Suddenly, three tough-looking guys attempted to confront Frank, but the moment they noticed the concealed gun under Frank's jacket, panic overcame them. Instead of resorting to violence, Frank caught them off guard by offering a substantial sum of cash and inviting them to a meeting in a hotel room. Following that incident, Frank and his crew received a tip from Delicio and rushed to meet with Clay. Frank explicitly expressed his desire to rejoin all their business ventures, but Clay adamantly declined. In response, Frank swiftly shoots Clay, ending his life without hesitation. With Clay out of the equation, Frank managed to reassemble his former associates. Subsequently, he paid a visit to the mayor, inquiring about the delayed funds for the Bronx hospital. The mayor informed him that there was no allocated budget and dared Frank to raise $16 million independently. To everyone's surprise, Frank embraced the challenge, despite his lawyer's cautionary advice. While sipping a drink, three detectives named Tommy, Roy, and Dennis abruptly apprehended him. His lawyer attempted to intervene, but the detectives paid no heed and took Frank away from the flow of traffic to avoid detection. Their destination was a quiet alley, where they presented Frank with an injured and unconscious man named Enrico. Frank professed complete ignorance about the situation, which irked the detectives. However, lacking concrete evidence, they couldn't arrest Frank. As it turned out, Enrico held significant sway in the Colombian drug gang, and the detectives harbored suspicions about Frank's involvement in the deaths of the last three gang leaders, all of which occurred after Frank's release from prison. In the meantime, Delicio met with Wang, a high-ranking member of the Chinese triad, inside a movie theater. Delicio conveyed a message from Frank, but Wang insisted on receiving payment in cash for an item weighing 220 pounds. Realizing Frank lacked the necessary funds, Delicio proposed a face-to-face meeting between Wang and Frank to negotiate a mutually beneficial arrangement. The following day, Jimmy made a brief stop at a fast food establishment. He generously offered money to an elderly woman and her grandchildren. Unexpectedly, detectives and police officers swarmed in, attempting to corner him. Jimmy found himself surrounded with no escape, and they promptly arrested him on charges of killing several Colombians, with Enrico's testimony serving as evidence. Meanwhile, Frank paid a visit to a struggling hospital in the Bronx, which was in dire need of government funding. He repeated his proposal to Wang, but they couldn't see eye to eye on the price for Wang's belongings. Frank brainstormed a partnership idea where they would jointly sell the items and share the proceeds to aid the hospital. However, Wang insisted on cash. Back at the hotel, Frank got wind of Jimmy's arrest and, fueled by determination, took action. Frank instructed his crew to quickly secure Jimmy's release. Later that night, Jennifer and the gang were dispatched to free Jimmy from custody. The 3 detectives showed up and were as mad as a swarm of bees seeing Jimmy walk free. Jennifer cautioned them that refusal to agree would lead to a court battle. Sometime later, in Chinatown, Frank and his crew arrived and identified the Chinese gangs. They went all out, wiping out every last gang member. After the intense showdown, they apprehended Wong and pressured him into surrendering all his possessions. To make Wong's day even worse, they didn't spare him even after he handed everything over. Let's just say his end came rather swiftly. A few days later, thanks to Frank's generous donation, the Bronx hospital finally opened its doors to the public. This news got Dennis all fired up. He believed that Frank had become the kingpin of New York while they were stuck in lousy jobs. He argued that the law favored Frank due to his substantial wealth, making it nearly impossible to apprehend him by following the established rules. To spice things up, Dennis hatched a plan for a group of detectives to go after Frank. It was like setting the stage for a clash between rival factions. However, Roy wasn't on board with Dennis's plan, but Dennis paid little heed to his objections. One night at a lively club, Frank's crew was having a blast, while Frank himself was engrossed in a phone call. After some time, Delizio showed up with a high-ranking drug cartel boss from Los Angeles. This individual was aware that Frank possessed a 200-pound item from Wong and wanted to purchase it. The hitch was that he couldn't pay the entire sum up front, so he proposed paying half immediately and the rest after the sale in Los Angeles. Frank, in his typical fashion, insisted on selling the entire item at once. The man requested some time to inspect the merchandise first. Unexpectedly, the moment he stepped outside, he eliminated one of the guards, exposing Delizio's secret collaboration. It didn't take long before a gang of armed individuals stormed the scene, turning it into utter chaos. Amidst the firefight, Frank managed to help Jimmy escape, but one of the attackers clung to their car door. When Jimmy attempted to subdue him, they discovered he was a cop. Frank didn't hold back and smacked him with a fire extinguisher. Seeing their buddy bite the dust, the rest of them started chasing Frank. Turns out, it was Tommy and Dennis tailing him. This turned into a high-speed race with lots of noisy gunshots. After they chased each other for a while, Frank finally gave Tommy and Dennis the slip in his car. As they looked for him, Frank crashed his car into theirs, making a big, loud mess. Taking advantage of the chaos, Jimmy started shooting and then made a run for it. Tommy jumped out of his car to chase Jimmy, but Dennis couldn't find Frank in the smashed-up cars under a bridge. There was a sudden bang, and it hit Tommy, but Jimmy didn't stop there. He shot Tommy a bunch more times, making him really, really hurt. But here comes the twist. Dennis showed up and started shooting Jimmy, ending his party for good. After dealing with Jimmy, Dennis tried to help Tommy, but it was too late for him. Dennis was all mixed up with feelings, sad about his buddies and feeling guilty. He couldn't stick around for the funeral, so he hopped into his car. But, surprise, surprise, another car showed up out of nowhere. Frank rolled down the window and said bye-bye to Dennis before walking away like it was no big deal. Back at the base, Frank had a chat with Delizio, who his guys had caught. Delizio spilled the beans, saying that Enrico had been teaming up with the cops to get rid of Frank. Delizio even spilled about getting a cool $50 million and a promise to get out of jail in exchange for snitching on Frank's secret spot. When Frank heard this, he told his gang to bury Delizio with that dirty money. When no one was looking, Roy got back home and found Frank waiting for him. Frank came clean about knocking off Clay, who made a ton of money with gambling tricks. He also said he got rid of Wong, a Chinatown businessman into shady immigrant stuff, and King Tito, who ran that creepy child prostitute scene in NYC. Frank said he only took out the bad guys, even if they were breaking the law. Then he hinted he might hire a hitman for anyone connected to his case. Before Frank left, he told Roy to cuff himself to a chair, but as soon as Frank split, Roy broke free and went after him into the subway. Inside a subway car, Frank used some poor passengers as a shield. Roy begged him to give up, but Frank didn't listen and ended his day right there. Then Frank calmly walked out of the station and hailed a taxi. Surprise, Frank wasn't unscathed. He had a serious gunshot wound from Roy. Now the cops got wind of the commotion and rushed over. The taxi driver, who saw Frank packing heat, got out of there pronto and called the cops. They started surrounding the taxi, trapping Frank inside. Frank, already pretty banged up, couldn't keep it together and bled out.